Hey guys, I'm here with Dr. James Dilley. He's an experimental archaeologist and slash Flintknapper. So welcome aboard, James. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so explain the experimental archaeologist thing to us and the Flintknapper for those who don't know what that is. I know what that is.
Okay. So an experimental archaeologist is not usually someone who will be out in a field as part of an excavation. It will be someone who will usually look at, I suppose, the post-excavation side of it, when you might have an artifact or a structure even that's no longer there, maybe just the post holes, or even an entire landscape. And they'll look at reconstructing that and working out how it was made, how it was used, and sometimes how it was destroyed, as it wasn't always by accident. And we have the job of piecing together the life story, I suppose, from raw material and sourcing that raw material all the way through to it ending up in the ground. So it's a very, very broad, wide area. And within experimental archaeology, you have specialists. And I guess that's where that flint knapping component comes into it, is that I am a professional flint napper. And a flint napper is someone who makes stone tools. Flint being the material, and napper, a Germanic word, which originally was noppen, to shape, usually by striking. So the two kind of fit together: flint striking, flint shaping by striking, flint napping. But particularly in the US and elsewhere around the world, you get lots of other materials, not just flint. Here in the UK, it's mostly flint tools. But the reason why it's almost always flint napping is because the word flint napping was really coined during the gunflint manufacture and the trade of the little flint locks for the muskets. And it's flint that provides a far superior spark. So that's where the word itself comes from that we use in archaeology.
So do you, like at this point, are you just trying to be like a reenactor? Like you just basically try to use anything that they would have had available to them back then? Or do you actually sometimes like get like modern day tools to kind of get the napping done?
It's a good question, and I'm going to slightly take your question and look at it in a slightly different way, because I am a reenactor. You're right, and I guess a reenactor could fall into a couple of different components, because I do reenactment from purely the hobbyist side. In fact, I do horrible Roman reenactment and medieval reenactment, not because I like the time period, because it's boring. You like Roman archaeology, you like standard, boring. Oh, we found a villa. What are we going to find? Oh, a type 2 greyware pottery. There's a brick. Was it a surprise? Probably not. You go on a prehistoric site, there are going to be surprises. But the chance to run around with armor on, walloping each other with lumps of steel, that's where the fun side is. But for the reenactment and experimental archaeology crossover, where you're making things to try and learn more about it using those authentic tools, it starts to become quite a gray area, because for reenactment, it's technically hobby, I guess, enjoyment. You, as I said, you're just going out there to have fun with friends. Are you generating research and data from that? Probably not very much, although some reenactors might turn around and say, yes, but we're building up experience and observational data. And my return of that would be, yes, but are you recording it? And that's where the difference lies. And even through my work, when I'm, let's say, making a stone axe, when I'm making that stone axe, potentially for a customer or a museum, I'm not making any, sometimes not even any observations unless something really weird happens. And I'm certainly not recording it unless it's part of a actual experiment with pre-thought parameters and hypotheses. I'm just doing it as a craftsman, as that professional flint napper, as a source of income. But that true experimental archaeology component is where you have to have that experiment. You need to have some kind of question in mind. So sticking with the stone axe, you could ask a question like, let's see, really thinking one off the bat here, but
Well, the one I loved the most that you did was I watched all your YouTube videos. The one where it's like the weird looking like almost like the arrowhead that is
Oh, the chisel arrowhead.
Yeah, the chisel arrowhead that looked
Yeah.
what it looked like, and you put it into like a gel block to show
Yeah.
that actually it actually was like, because previously people were thinking that it was almost just like decorative or something. They didn't really think it was that functional, but you proved that actually it does pierce an animal quite deep and it leaves the wound open, and it kind of makes a lot of sense actually.
Sure. And I suppose you could use that as data within an experiment to show that for this particular arrowhead, for those watching that don't have, in fact, like your arrowhead collection, it's me looking to see if I've got one handy. Bear with.
This is my arrowhead collection. That's a fulsome point. Those are
Suppose this is where I should have had some props. We can compare arrowheads at this point.
Yeah.
So here's my one of British arrowheads. So I will start to get a couple out so you can actually.
And these are not
see.
ones that you've made. These are ones you found.
No, these are the real thing. These were left to me by another Flintknapper, a UK Flintknapper who passed away and left a huge collection of artifacts. And it's like, well, what do I do with these things? And you use them for engagement, I guess, for the public archaeology side. So the earliest type of invasively flaked arrowhead from the Neolithic is a leaf arrowhead, and it's the kind of arrowhead that you'll see almost around the world. You will almost definitely have them in the US, you'll find them in Africa, Asia, well, much of the world really, and they range in size and shape from these sort of teardrop ones, as I said, to these more kite-shaped arrowheads, two leaf arrowheads, slightly different shape from the early Neolithic, and those then progress
that one again,
into
because it kind of
Yep.
the video kind of went off when.
Yeah, sure. So these are those slightly more kite-shaped arrowheads.
Oh, okay.
So similar, but I guess slightly more geometric, maybe, but still the same sort of shape. But from the middle Neolithic onwards, and these are the arrowheads that you brought up from the video, are these chisel arrowheads. And this is the way that they would have been oriented, with the arrow shaft where my fingers are holding them. So they would have had this really wide end to them. You can see some consistency in that they have a little bit of a notch to them as I lay one over the other, which may have facilitated attaching them to the shaft, possibly not. But for many, they've sort of wondered, well, why would you have the wide end at the front? Surely the piercing power will be very, very poor. Were they for something else? Were they for scaring people? Just showing someone, oh yeah, you could get hit by one of these. You wouldn't want to because it looks pretty nasty. Or were they for making a noise? Or were they for hitting people but not causing mortal wounds because there may be some social taboo about killing people? Who knows? But we showed through the video on YouTube, which is on the Ancient Craft channel, that you can loose one of these arrows into the ballistics gel that you saw, and it'll penetrate pretty deep, over 20 centimeters, which is more than enough for a mortal wound for a large mammal, and actually leave a wound channel open around the arrow shaft. So it will facilitate continued bleeding rather than an arrow going into the wound and then plugging it behind it. So pretty nasty. But very, very simple to make. These are just flakes that have been slightly retouched down the sides. The leaf arrowheads and the perhaps slightly more recognizable barbed and tanged arrowheads, which come later, take a long time and a lot of skill to make. You could be looking at half an hour to make one of these, sometimes more. Whereas with one of these chisel arrowheads, 10 minutes, maybe less, and far less skill. So there's some interesting economy going on there. And we don't get these arrowheads at the same time. You get your leaf arrowheads, your chisel arrowheads, oblique arrowheads, which are one in between. And I don't know if I do have a oblique, which looks similar to the barbed and tanged arrowhead. So similar, a bit like the Star Trek symbol.
I was gonna say it's Star Trek one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's you can see where the early origins of the barbed and tanged comes in, although this one's missing its tang, but it's there. You can see the development. And then Flint arrowheads in Britain disappear from the early Bronze Age, and archery no longer has a place anymore. People are not hunting wild animals very frequently at all. And in fact, from the early Neolithic, people are not hunting wild animals that much at all. They're all farmers. But it's a huge picture that you can start to put together and go off on a real tangent. So for that component,
how will you walk us through the dating, how they actually would date one of these?
Sure. Not by itself. If we had no prior knowledge of how old these arrowheads were, and either I found them in a field or someone found them in a field, we would have no idea. And I suppose when you start to go back to some of the early antiquarians, or even much earlier, maybe hundreds of years ago, when people are finding these arrowheads and making very wide suggestions that they might be pre-Roman or maybe fairy arrows, because they just don't have a clue. We've got no idea. We need some other material found with them in context, within the same layer, the same place, non-disturbed, to actually give some kind of material to date. It might be charcoal, it might be some organic material. There are other types of stone material that you can date, but not flint, sadly. Even if I found one of them today by itself, I could give you a fairly rough date that might be a few hundred years. But for a fairly recent find, I found a Mesolithic axe in a field close to us. But that could, the range in how old it is could be thousands of years. It could be 11,000 years. It could be 8,000 years. It's a pretty broad, open picture.
So what about the uranium atom dating? Like, how does that, I mean, I know you can do that in some rock. Like, how does that work?
For uranium or any radioactive dating, it relies on a material absorbing that radioactive material, or even releasing it at a measurable rate. And for flint, we just don't have that data or research yet to be able to date things consistently. You do have a way of dating obsidian that I know of. We don't have in Britain, but you have in the US and elsewhere, and it's based on the amount of moisture that it absorbs, obsidian hydration. But with flint, it's so inconsistent. Even just the raw material straight from the quarry, it's so inconsistent. And then when it's in the ground, it becomes even more inconsistent, that it becomes very difficult to date. There are attempts to try and find ways to directly date and even trace flint, but they're not looking hugely successful at the moment. That may change, but not at the moment.
Okay, so do you think that this was the kind of thing where it's like everybody made like, is it like it was the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker? Was it everybody had their own little task, so there was a napper in every little tribe? Or do you think it was a thing where everybody kind of tried their hand at it because it was a necessity?
It's a good question, and it's one that comes up reasonably frequently, because we see ourselves in the modern world as, oh, you work for a bank, or you're a bus driver, and we have that division of labor to try and help society move around, and it's a very modern concept. And certainly in the Bronze Age and the Neolithic, when farming came in, that division of labor would have been important. And you start to see that high level of output of whether it be nice pottery or stone tools, or almost certainly woodworking or clothing that we don't see, that individuals would have had to have specialized in. But if we go further back from the Neolithic, pre-farming, when people were living as hunter-gatherers, you may well have had individuals who were better at some of those tasks and slightly more experienced, but it's quite likely that most people had a pretty decent grasp of most crafts. Because certainly for a hunter-gatherer society, if you're, as part of your seasonal movement from inland to by the sea or to gather resources, if you're separated from your group, either intentionally or accidentally, and you're not able to make functional stone tools, and you're asking for trouble, really. It would really make sense to have a fairly decent grasp of being able to make a projectile point or a scraper, because you might be away for several days or even weeks sometimes. So it's quite likely that the further back you go in time, the skills would be shared quite widely and possibly to a similar level. But as we go further forward, there is that skills division.
Okay, that does make a lot of sense. Okay, so I have to commend you on doing, like, you actually like mush up your own or grind up your own ore and then smelt things down and like all the way to a sword point, or whatever. Like, how did you in malachite too, like that's how did you get into that? Like, that's awesome.
Well, for whether it be the stone tools or experimental archaeology in general, or just archaeology, I've been interested in archaeology since, well, maybe 6, 7 years old. I can remember being interested in it in primary school. And like most kids, really liking Egyptology, because kids are morbid. They like horrible things and dead bodies and mummies and tombs and that sort of thing. It's got all the appeal. But I probably had, whilst in primary school, the most mature thoughts I've ever had back then. I still haven't been able to top it. When you watch all of these documentaries, the National Geographic, Discovery do in Egypt and for Egyptology, for any of the tombs that are opened, or any of the sites, they're either led or opened by Egyptians and Egyptian archaeologists, quite rightly, usually. And the days of English gentlemen going over to Egypt and cracking open tombs to display to an eager audience back in Victorian England are long gone, thankfully. So I guess because at a young age, the romance somewhat wasn't quite the same from those stories that you grew up on Howard Carter and the like, I started to become interested in the archaeology around me. And I suppose as a kid, like many, making things is such a fun thing. Lego is one of those things that encourages that making and imagination. The prehistory is time when, for most of the products or processes, they don't require complex machinery or steps. They're processes that you can pretty much imagine in front of you. You don't have to think of really out of the box concepts to put together. So stone tools, for example, you can pick up the flint, your pebble, and you can start hitting it with varying degrees of success, but that's it. That's the process, really. And even for bronze casting or copper smelting, it is a little more complex, but not that much more complex. So as a kid who loved archaeology and making things, the two combine together really well. And we have flint all around us here. I'm in an area south of Cambridge in East Anglia. We have flint everywhere. You can find it all over. So going out into the nearby fields and picking up some of that raw material, bringing it home and bashing it with pebbles from the beach, it was fairly easy. Not with that much success initially, but it could be easily done. And as I was channeled through archaeology into a young archaeologist club that we have in the UK, and we've got various branches around the UK at different museums, they encourage that sort of thing and can send you on little holiday trips to different parts of the UK where you can have a go excavating or drawing a site or handling objects, or the experimental archaeology side. And I did that and was absolutely hooked. They had a Flintknapper there and someone doing bronze casting, and must have been maybe age 11 or 12. I decided that is what I want to do. That's got everything for me. And lo and behold, it sort of happens.
Wow, that's really amazing. So I mean, like, you made me really nervous in one of your videos when you were knapping glass, like a big glass chunk. I was like, oh God, that's gonna fly up and get into his eye. Or I mean, because you would be like with the stone, and then like a sharp like sliver of glass would come off, and I'm like, man, that's some risky stuff there, actually.
It is super, super sharp. I mean, I've got a flint hand axe that I have on the desk, and this is British flint. I realise that's very bright, and hopefully it'll tone down a little bit. But this is just an ovate hand axe. It's not razor sharp around the outside. It's one of my ones, But if it's used like a bread knife with a saw in action, it will cut. But for the glass one, hopefully I won't knock the camera too much. It's me feeling for it. Oh, yeah, that feels like glass. You can hopefully see pretty much right through that's just a glass hand axe. Very similar, has the same kind of serrated edge to it. And it'll work in the same way, and I can squeeze the blade as tight as I like and it won't cut. But with a fresh flake, as you saw, if that just glances you, it will slice you, and you probably won't know it. It will be so sharp. And like obsidian, which is a volcanic natural glass, both glass and obsidian can have an edge once flaked of 1 molecule in thickness, and surgical steel is 2 to 3 molecules thick, so it's significantly sharper. But the gloves and goggles are necessary.
Yeah, well, that's like I would have to wear that in modern day times just because. But okay, so I with the round, okay, like you did one about the axe, and you said like when they were, you know, rough around the edges or whatever, you could like you basically I remember the argument being that like if you were cutting down like a tree or something, like you're more likely to break this tool if it's like this versus when they would polish them off, and if they needed them to last longer they would completely polish them off. So how did they actually get them so smooth?
Well, the smoothing process is fairly straightforward, and it's just taking your freshly flaked axe head and just grinding it on a piece of sandstone continually for up to 60 hours until the surface is smooth. Simple as that, really. But that process takes away all of those flake scars, so the surface, as you said, is smooth. And that's important because when I'm flaking the stone or flint, those ridges and flake scars will act as highways, I suppose, because they're the highest point for the shock that I'm putting in to travel. So they'll focus at certain points. For something like an axe head, if it's going under continuous shock as it's hitting the tree as you're trying to knock it down, for a material that's fairly brittle like flint, you don't really want localized stress and strain because it can cause microfractures, which can get bigger and then cause that to fail and break. But if you polish the surface smooth, there are none of those ridges. The shock must travel over the surface evenly, so it just spreads out that stress and strain and improves the lifespan of an axe head.
Okay, yeah, that's really, really awesome. So did you like what do you feel like with the timing of from like the ice age to now, what like how do you account for like some of the missing parts, like where like they stopped using stone and all that? Like what do you think it's, you know?
It's clearly it's a very complex and colorful picture, and for some of the parts in that story, we know what that story contains. For some areas, they're a little more elusive, but I think with more sites that have been found and better ways of either tracing raw materials or even genetic tracing, we'll start to have more of a complete picture. I'm just trying to think of an example, but even our understanding of how Neanderthals fit into the picture of the human timeline, we're starting to get more and more evidence and data as archaeological science improves. We've got a huge amount of material in stone tools and Neanderthal bones, but whether it be looking at their teeth to work out what they were eating, down to some of the sites that they were living in, we can start to piece together a much more vibrant picture of the way that they were living and how they interacted with us as modern humans. So that there are a lot of questions still out there, and prehistory is going to be the area that has the most questions because it lacks what it has in the title, history, the written word. There are some outliers when you get Sumerian and early cuneiform language, but on the whole, prehistory is lacking consistent and broad written text. So it's the job of experimental archaeologists like myself to try and piece back those missing pieces. And one analogy I always like to use with people, because when I'm doing a display, or even we were filming up in Scotland with the BBC, and I was being asked lots of questions about how Neanderthals lived, but we just don't have the evidence. We don't know what they dressed like. We don't know what they would have consistently eaten. We get little bits of evidence from certain places, but we don't know how complex their cooking was. So prehistory is a bit like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And you're looking at the box and you've got this really excellent, colorful, vibrant picture of culture, language, everything you would expect from intelligent people in that complex society. But you look inside the box of archaeology, the archaeology puzzle, and over that many thousands of years, where all that evidence has been shifted around and some of it's rotted away, from 1,000 pieces, you're now down to 3 bits. So you've got to be quite strategic with how you move those 3 bits round to try and work out some picture to be able to tell the story of archaeology. And that's where, over time, some of those pieces can be refound to add to a pre-existing piece to try and make the picture a little more obvious. But that's essentially where we're at. And the other issue is that different specialists can interpret those pieces in different ways, and quite rightly. That's the beauty of archaeology, is that you have different opinions of how that puzzle should look if you didn't have the box lid. So it's a continuous, ever-developing story, is prehistory.
Yeah, and I often think about like the entropy in general, and about how, okay, in 10,000 years from now, what in my house will be in existence, we don't tend to use a lot of stone, so I don't really know, like your metal will corrode and your wood will disintegrate, and your, like whatever, there's no fabric that will be left, or it's so it is really interesting to try to that's a good point. You're only piecing together with like very small, we only have a couple of pieces of the puzzle. So so you do this thing for BBC all the time, or what is this thing you're doing with BBC?
It's we're working, I work for myself. Ancient Craft is my business, and occasionally I get asked to be involved with different media productions. So I've worked an awful lot with Dilley and I, which I think are US-based publishers who do lots of books for kids. And I do TV stuff with a whole variety of channels and media companies around the world, either as an expert standing back with the crew just as a consultant, or as someone on camera demonstrating some of those skills or talking about them, or just archaeology. For this project, my partner and I were asked to go all the way up to deepest, darkest northern Scotland to actually be Neanderthals for a BBC documentary called Attenborough and the Mammoth Graveyard, with David Attenborough, as a site has been found in Wiltshire with a huge amount of mammoth remains. And we have lots of gravel pits in the UK that have Ice Age bones in them. But importantly, this site has stone tools associated with those mammoth remains, and Neanderthal stone tools. And the archaeologists working on it are quite excited and hopeful that they've got mammoth bones with cut marks and the stone tools, and they're very well preserved. So it will be a very interesting site to excavate. So we provided some of the reconstructions, had to look a little more Neanderthal, as I'd like to try and maintain a modern human appearance to myself, and wearing the full animal skins, demonstrating stone tools, firelighting, and hunting with some CGI mammoths in the distance. But for parts of Scotland, they have an environment that is perfect for an Ice Age European proxy environment. So that's why we were all the way up there.
So I was surprised to learn from one of your videos, like, so you guys had lemmings and hyenas all the way in England, and rhinos, like,
and hippopotami as well.
So that suggests, like, wouldn't that mean you guys were warmer?
Well, yes, yeah, it was not significantly warmer, not like the not like Central Africa is today, but it would have been warmer. So not too much more, but a lot of those animals are pretty able to live in semi-warm, temperate environments. But for Trafalgar Square, a fairly well-known London monument, if you were to, and I'm not suggesting you do, but if you were to lift the paving slabs and start to dig underneath, you'd start to hit a gravel bed that is absolutely full of mainly hippopotamus bones, but cave lions, bears, you name it. There's a gravel terrace just under there that is full of Ice Age archaeology. There were many different, very large megafauna that would have been living around the Thames Basin, not that many thousands of years ago.
Well, I guess, I mean, that makes sense because you would have had Doggerland would have been above ground, and you have the Mediterranean wasn't what it was. Like, it would have connected to Africa more. So, yeah, so I guess there would have been a bigger migration going on. I just never really, I just never really heard about all of that coming over there. I mean, in the US, we have giant camels and giant sloths, and there's a big woolly mammoth site about an hour from me, like where there was a nursery herd of like 16 woolly mammoths holding their babies found. So yeah, there's there's saber-tooth tigers and all that kind of stuff there. But I was really surprised about the camels. I didn't know that that was a North American thing.
Yeah, we don't have sloth. That's definitely part of the I think mainly South American continent. I think you've got some in the Northern American continent as well. But yeah, I've definitely been in situations where there've been an Ice Age reconstruction done for Europe, and it's, oh, we've got a giant sloth. No, you can't have that. Sorry. That's we didn't have them, or even saber-toothed cats. It's not something that we would have had a lot of. Plenty of cave lions, but big smilodons, no.
So do you look a lot at the cave drawings?
Cave art isn't my specialism, but I've certainly been to some of the cave art sites in Europe, and if you want to have sort of a moment where you really feel very closely connected to people from prehistory, if you've never been to any kind of cave site where you can see the outline of someone's hand and you're able to go quite close to it, I'd recommend it, because you may have been used to seeing the bones of people that have lived thousands of years ago, all their tools, but to actually see the outline of someone's skin from 14,000 years ago is it has a moment to it. I'm not someone who usually, I guess, dwells on that sort of thing. I tend to be quite hard-nosed academic about it. Even I sort of, it can be a little overwhelming, I suppose, that art has that effect on people.
So
and
is it identical to our hands?
Say that again.
Is it identical to our hands?
Very similar, but it's quite consistent to see hand prints that are missing digits, and whether they were doing it like so or whether they were actually missing a digit, who knows. But actually my academic supervisor was involved with some research that's identified Neanderthal cave art, but previous to that was looking at many of these European Ice Age handprints and found that a lot of them were almost certainly female handprints, but based on the slender nature of many of the fingers, from a morphological perspective, which is quite interesting. Again, that's a piece of one of those puzzles.
Why do you think that? Like, I mean, they have that all over. We even have petroglyphs in the US and like in South America. They always have the hand with it's like they blew like acid or something. What did they blow on to like make it
ochre?
Ochre. How did that stick on the stone that long?
Well, ochre is a very, very resistant material to rotting. It's just rust, essentially. It's iron oxide. And you can heat that iron oxide to change its color, or you can find it in a slightly different shade, from yellows, reds, the common one, purples, or even something close to a brown. But the reason it doesn't rot away is because it's just stone and it's been applied to that rock. If it's within a cave or a rock shelter that's relatively protected, there's nothing that's going to affect it. If there's some kind of organic mixture to it, whether it be saliva or perhaps something like egg, to provide that more of a paint product to it, then clearly that will rot away. But the rock isn't, the actual pigment ain't going anywhere. And for some of the Magdalenian, the late Ice Age sites in Europe, where you've got these layers within caves, you'll have the really early Neanderthal, Mousterian, or even Acheulean hand axe layers. Then maybe Neanderthals, early modern humans in the Aurignacian and Gravettian, maybe a Solutrean layer for the big spears, and then finally a Magdalenian layer. And you can almost always identify them because that layer will be bright red. And that's just because it seems like they were covering themselves, their clothing, the walls, everything in ochre. And some of that has come off the walls, perhaps where their clothes have started to rot into the ground, or some of it sort of fell off their bodies, or as body paint or clothes, it's just ended up in the ground. It hasn't rotted anywhere, it's just stayed there, and you'll get this stained layer of red.
Yeah, that's super bizarre. I actually think it's bizarre that that we have that many like stenciled hands all over the globe. I think it's cool. It's really cool. So what do you make of places like Göbekli Tepe that are like pushing the timeline back of sorry.
No, that's all right. I think it broke up a little bit there. So there are clearly a number of sites, and I guess you could have that list in front of you or in your head of these amazing sites which are just pushing back what we, I guess, would normally think of for prehistoric people, whether it be somewhere like Çatalhöyük or Stonehenge, or for many of these other amazing sites that either have exceptional preservation or are made from a very hard stone that keep them together. And I guess it really comes down to humanity and the way that societies can work together occasionally, whether it be for a greater good or not. For someone like Stonehenge closer to me, clearly that is not the work of one group or one tribe, if they had tribe, or one family group. There's no way that you could execute something like that. To create something like that, or any major stone megalith with joints or advanced stonework, you clearly need a number of specialists. That stone has to be sourced and brought from somewhere. You might need the permission of a group that lived on that land that had that stone or that material, that specialist. There has to be a huge amount of cooperation involved in that, and trying to convince other groups that you want to be involved with this, it will be worthwhile, and we will have some kind of benefit from it, I suppose, has a real human quality into it. When I suppose when we flick on the news today, and there might be someone from a political background who's trying to convince us all that this particular thing is worth doing, and it's for the greater good. Is it for their benefit, or is it for our benefit? And it's likely it was exactly the same thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and I also always have to keep in mind that, like, even if you take Stonehenge, it's like, I mean, there was a whole outer ring that's been removed, and like a lot of buildings in London have some of the blue stone like in them. Like, people have been like, that is not what it was. Like, that we're seeing like a skeleton of what the thing was, and we don't even know what other building materials would have been involved, or if it was covered at one point, or like, we kind of think of it as like this like sacred stone circle, but we actually don't really know when it was actually constructed what its function was, or how big it was. Or, I mean, we know how big, we know it was bigger than it is now, but
yeah. And it's, I guess, for for the sake of Stonehenge, is that clearly it's been knocked down and altered at various points in time, and stone circles in the area underwent the same thing, that Christianity coming in with the pre-Christian symbols and sites there, that at times was an interest in covering these things up. And for Avebury stone circle that isn't far away, all the stones were buried intentionally to hide them, and many of them were smashed and broken up, and as you said, make up a lot of the buildings and houses in the area. Stonehenge is an interesting site, and it's also not a terribly interesting site. It's actually quite archaeologically sterile. People often say, where would be the best place, most interesting place to excavate? Oh, I'd love to excavate in the middle of Stonehenge. It's really quite sterile. There's not a great deal of archaeology below the surface there at all. I suppose it says a lot about the site. Were people keeping it very clean and tidy because it was this special place, or was it the act of building the monument that was the special component of it? That it wasn't that there were these activities going on, it was just the building, and being part of that, it's a monument to that cooperation and the journey of making that building. That's one potential part of it anyway, and that might just be a facet of the bigger picture, who knows. But I suppose the story of it is really quite complete these days for Stonehenge. There's not a great deal left that we don't know. I've often get asked, would you like to go back in time? And is there a particular time that you would like to go back to? And would you stay there? Usually expecting to say, oh, I'd love to go back and see what Stonehenge was really for. But the problem is that if you chose your one opportunity to go back in time and you went back to Stonehenge, if you went back in time and it turns out that the people in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age were using Stonehenge exactly as we've interpreted as archaeologists, you'd come back and not really learn anything. You would have seen it in use,
right?
But that's it. But if you went back in time and it was being used for something absolutely unexpected and totally unbelievable, no one would believe you. So again, you've potentially wasted that opportunity. So I'd much rather go back in time, maybe watch a bronze smith make a sword from start to finish, because at least you can watch it and appreciate that process and perhaps learn a few little craftsperson tips along the way. And I suppose that's where the story of prehistory is a little more subtle, is that you have these big mysteries of prehistory like Stonehenge, but actually it's not that much of a mystery. We know that the stones came from Wales, and we pretty much know where they came from. We know that the site was an important annual meeting and feasting spot to line up with the winter solstice, so that farmers had some idea of when to plant their crops without a calendar. But other than that, it's within a landscape for the dead.
Well, there's a lot of, not at Stonehenge per se, but there's a lot of other hinges and things that have never been dug up. Like there's a lot of other stuff that, like, there's a lot of mounds and things that can be I feel like I think you're right in that. I think that place has been tapped out. Like there's a lot of places that have yet to even been uncovered, which would be like super cool, super interesting. Okay, so tell us a little bit about your projects, and then about how people can buy some of your stuff, like, and all that, and where they can find you.
Well, at the moment we're gearing up for Christmas. We've just finished with all of our summer seasonal events, as much of our year is going to different museums and providing displays of flintknapping and bronze casting, or doing all of the media stuff as aforementioned. As we get into the winter season, when people don't want to go outside very much and they're not prepared to stand and watch a craftsperson in the rain bash rocks, that sort of thing tends to grind to a halt. We will be working hopefully with New Scientist Live next year in Manchester in January, but that'll be inside, thankfully. So for the projects for the moment, it'll either be repairing kit, improving our materials and equipment for casting and running workshops, so people can come and cast their own bronze sword or make their own stone axe, or making all of these products, as you said, that are on the website, which is ancientcraft.co.uk, and we're on social media, which is just at ancientcraftuk, where we'll have all of those videos that you've said on our YouTube channel, or just a constant daily feed of all the things that either myself or Em are making, or all the various projects. We have a a series, I suppose, called Nap Time, which is something we started at the start of the unprecedented times of COVID during lockdown to provide free Flintknapper tuition, and it became so popular so quickly we had to move it from Twitter as a live video onto YouTube because it
Okay,
just
so
couldn't.
wait, what is it? Is it like you just live feed, show yourself napping?
Some of it's live, some of it initially it was live, and then it for the amount of people that were watching it, I think for the first or maybe second episode or lesson, we had about 14,000 people trying to watch it, and it caused a huge amount of problems for people. Like, I couldn't watch it for this reason. It's like, right, well, we'll just pre-record it and put it on YouTube so that, you know,
I
if you're in a
noticed when I
store, it's
watched you making a couple of that, like that glass sphere or whatever, and that point, and it was like 40 minutes, and you're actually like, you get to see you basically through the whole process, and I was like, this is kind of like watching a Bob Ross painting. It's like,
yeah.
you know, it's got like a little bit of like a chill, like, oh, like it's, you know, like a kind of like a fire roasting kind of thing. It's really,
yeah. That's the next thing we'll need is sort of some amusing background artwork or something that, or sort of at the end, did you spot the thing, to see if people are actually watching. But yeah, that's we'll actually be opening or reopening the shop, because if you go on the website now, there'll be a few things that you can buy immediately, but not very many, because I'm desperately trying to catch up with a lot of the orders that came through in the summer. But on November 10th, we will be opening the shop again, and we do international shipping. Most of our orders go to the US, but and at that point you can put in your Christmas order, so that you can treat yourself or a family friend.
yeah, any history buff you got there, yeah. And
Yes,
little kids
exactly.
would love this stuff too.
Yes, yeah, with supervision, especially for those pointy swords. But yeah, that's us.
That's really, really cool. Well, James, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure having you on. And yeah, I'm going to follow all your projects. And yeah, I think that you're, yeah, I don't know. I think you're on to something cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess a childhood dream and enjoyment that's become a full-time business and only
Well, I
occasionally
mean,
a chore.
but compared to, I mean, you know, you're one of, like, you know, compared to being somebody who works in an office, like this is like, yeah, this is awesome. Cool.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me.